Chapter 17, The Propaganda of History. How the facts of American history have in the last half century been falsified because the nation was ashamed. The South was ashamed because it fought to perpetuate human slavery. The North was ashamed because it had to call in the black men to save the Union, abolish slavery, and establish democracy. What are American children taught about Reconstruction? Helen Boardman has made a study of current textbooks and notes these three dominant theses. 1, all Negroes were ignorant. Quote, all were ignorant of public business, end quote. Woodburn and Moran, Elementary American History and Government, page 397. Quote, although the Negroes were now free, they were also ignorant and unfit to govern themselves, unquote. Everett Barnes, American History for Grammar Grades, page 334. Quote, the Negroes got control of these states. They had been slaves all their lives and were so ignorant they did not even know the letters of the alphabet. Yet they now sit in the state legislatures and made the laws, end quote. D.H. Montgomery, The Leading Facts of American History, page 332. Quote, in the South, the Negroes who had so suddenly gained their freedom did not know what to do with it, end quote. Hubert Cornish and Thomas Hughes, History of the United States for Schools, page 335. In the legislatures, the Negroes were so ignorant that they could only watch their white leaders, carpetbaggers, and vote aye or no as they were told, end quote. S.E. Foreman, Advanced American History, Revised Edition, page 452. Quote, some legislatures were made up of a few dishonest white men and several Negroes making too ignorant to know anything about lawmaking, end quote. Hubert Cornish and Thomas Hughes, History of the United States for Schools, page 349. Thesis 2, all Negroes were lazy, dishonest, and extravagant. Quote, these men knew not only nothing about government, but also cared for nothing except what they could gain for themselves, end quote. Helen F. Giles, How the United States Became a World Power, page 7. Quote, legislatures were often at the mercy of Negroes, childishly ignorant, who sold their votes openly and whose loyalty was gained by allowing them to eat, drink, and clothe themselves at the state's expense, end quote. William J. Long, America, A History of Our Country, page 392. Quote, some Negroes spent their money foolishly and were worse off than they had been before, end quote. Carl Russell Fish, History of America, page 385. Quote, this assistance led many freed men to believe that they needed to no longer work. They also ignorantly believed that the lands of their former masters were to be turned over by Congress to them, and that every Negro would have his allotment, 40 acres and a mule, end quote. W.F. Gordy, History of the United States, Part 2, page 336. Thinking that slavery meant toil and that freedom meant only idleness, the slave, after he was set free, was disposed to try out his freedom by refusing to work, end quote. S.E. Foreman, Advanced American History, Revised Edition. Quote, they began to wander about, stealing and plundering. In 1 week, in a Georgia town, 150 Negroes were arrested for thieving, end quote. Helen F. Giles, How the United States Became a World Power, page 6. Thesis number 3, Negroes were responsible for bad government during Reconstruction. Quote, foolish laws were passed by the black lawmakers. The public money was wasted terribly and thousands of dollars were stolen straight. Self-respecting Southerners chafed under the horrible regime, end quote. Emerson David Fite, These United States, page 37. Quote, in the exhausted states already amply punished by the desolation of war, the rule of the Negro and his unscrupulous carpetbagger and scalawag patrons was an orgy of extravagance, fraud, and disgusting incompetency, end quote. David Seville Muzzy, History of the American People, page 408. Quote, the picture of Reconstruction which the average pupil in these 16 states receives is limited to the South. The South found it necessary to pass the Black Codes for the control of the shiftless and sometimes vicious freedmen. The Freedmen's Bureau caused the Negroes to look to the North rather than to the South for support, and by giving them a false sense of equality, did more harm than good. With the scalawags, the ignorant and non-property holding Negroes under the leadership of the carpetbaggers engaged in a wild orgy of spending in the legislatures. The humiliation and distress of the Southern whites was in part relieved by the Ku Klux Klan, a secret organization which frightened the superstitious blacks. End quote. Grounded in such elementary and high school teaching, an American youth attending college today will learn from the current textbooks of history that the Constitution recognized slavery, that the chance of getting rid of slavery by peaceful methods was ruined by abolitionists, that after the period of Andrew Jackson, the two sections of the United States, quote, had become fully conscious of their conflicting interests, two irreconcilable forms of civilization. In the North, the democratic. In the South, a more stationary and aristocratic civilization. End quote. He would read that Harriet Beecher Stowe brought on the Civil War, that the assault on Charles Sumner was due to his, quote, coarse invective, end quote, against a South Carolina senator, and that Negroes were the only people to achieve emancipation with no effort on their part. That Reconstruction was a disgraceful attempt to subject white people to ignorant Negro rule. And that, according to a Harvard professor of history, end quote, legislative expenses were grotesquely extravagant, the colored members in some states engaging in a saturnalia of corrupt expenditure, end quote. Encyclopedia Britannica, 14th edition, volume 22, page 815, by Frederick Jackson Turner. In other words, he would in all probability complete his education without any idea of the part which the black race has played in America, of the tremendous moral problem of abolition, of the cause and meaning of the Civil War, and the relation which Reconstruction had to democratic government and the labor movement today. Herein lies more than mere omission and difference of emphasis. The treatment of the period of Reconstruction reflects small credit upon American historians as scientists. We have too often a deliberate attempt so to change the facts of history that the story will make pleasant reading for Americans. The editors of the 14th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica asked me for an article on the history of the American Negro. From my manuscript, they cut out all my references to Reconstruction. I insisted on including the following statement, quote, white historians have ascribed the faults and failures of Reconstruction to Negro ignorance and corruption. But the Negro insists that it was Negro loyalty and the Negro vote alone that restored the South to the Union, established the new democracy, both for white and black, and instituted the public schools, end quote. This editor refused to print, although he said that the article otherwise was, quote, in my judgment and in the judgments of others in the office, an excellent one, and one with which it seemed to me we may all be well satisfied, end quote. I was not satisfied and refused to allow the article to appear. War, and especially civil strife, leave terrible wounds. It is the duty of humanity to heal them. It was therefore soon conceived as neither wise nor patriotic to speak of all the causes of strife and the terrible results to which sectional differences in the United States had led. And first of all, we minimized the slavery controversy which convulsed the nation from the Missouri Compromise down to the Civil War. On top of that, we passed by Reconstruction with a phrase of regret or disgust. But are these reasons of courtesy and philanthropy sufficient for denying truth? If history is going to be scientific, if the record of human action is going to be set down with that accuracy and faithfulness of detail which will allow its use as a measuring rod and guidepost for the future of nations, there must be some set standard of ethics in research and interpretation. If, on the other hand, we're going to use history for our pleasure and amusement, for inflating our national ego, and giving us a false but pleasurable sense of accomplishment, then we must give up the idea of history either as science or as an art, using the results of science and admit frankly that we are using a version of historic fact in order to influence and educate the new generation along the way we wish. It is propaganda like this that has led men in the past to insist that history is, quote, lies agreed upon, end quote, and to point out the danger in such misinformation. It is indeed extremely doubtful if any permanent benefit comes to the world through such action. Nations reel and stagger on their way. They make hideous mistakes. They commit frightful wrongs. They do great and beautiful things. And shall we not best guide humanity by telling the truth about all this, so far as the truth is ascertainable? Here in the United States, we have a clear example. It was morally wrong and economically retrogressive to build human slavery in the United States in the 18th century. We know that now perfectly well. And there were many Americans, North and South, who knew this and said it in the 18th century. Today, in the face of new slavery established elsewhere in the world under other names and guises, we ought to emphasize this lesson of the past. Moreover, it is not well to be reticent in describing that past. Our history tends to discuss American slavery so impartially that in the end, nobody seems to have done wrong and everybody was right. Slavery appears to have been thrust upon unwilling, helpless America, while the South was blameless in becoming its center. The difference of development, North and South, is explained as a sort of working out of cosmic social and economic law. One reads, for instance, Charles and Mary Beard's, quote, Rise of American Civilization, end quote, with the comfortable feeling that nothing right or wrong is involved. Manufacturing and industry developed in the North develops in the South. Manufacturing and industry develop in the North. Feudalism develops in the South. They clash as winds and waters strive, and the stronger forces develop the tremendous industrial machine that governs us so magnificently and selfishly today. Yet in this sweeping mechanistic interpretation, there is no room for the real plot of the story, for the clear mistake and guilt of rebuilding a new slavery of the working class in the midst of a fateful experiment in democracy, for the triumph of sheer moral courage and sacrifice in the abolition crusade, and for the hurt and struggle of degraded Black millions in their fight for freedom and their attempt to enter democracy. Can all this be omitted or half suppressed in a treatise that calls itself scientific? Or To come nearer to the center and climax of this fascinating history, what was slavery in the United States? Just what did it mean to the owner and the owned? Shall we accept the conventional story of the old slave plantation and its owner's fine aristocratic life of cultured leisure? Or shall we note slave biographies, like those of Charles Ball, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Frederick Douglass, the careful observations of Olmsted, and the indictment of Hinton Helper? No one can read that first thin autobiography of Frederick Douglass and have left many illusions about slavery. And if truth is our object, no amount of flowery romance and the personal reminiscence of its protected beneficiaries can keep the world from knowing that slavery was cruel, dirty, costly, and inexcusable anachronism, which nearly ruined the world's greatest experiment in democracy. No serious and unbiased student can be deceived by the fairy tale of a beautiful Southern slave civilization. If those who really had opportunity to know the South before the war wrote the truth, it was a center of widespread ignorance, undeveloped resources, suppressed humanity, and unrestrained passions with whatever veneer of manners and culture that could lie above these depths. Coming now to the Civil War. How for a moment anyone who reads the Congressional Globe from 1850 to 1860, the lives of contemporary statesmen and public charters, North and South, the discourses in the newspaper and accounts of meetings and speeches doubt that Negro slavery was the cause of the Civil War. What do we gain by evading this clear fact and talking in vague ways about the Union and states' rights and differences in civilization as the cause of that catastrophe? Of all historic facts, there can be none clearer than that for 4 long and fearful years, the South fought to perpetuate human slavery, and that the nation which, quote, rose so bright and fair and died so pure of stain, end quote, was one that had a perfect right to be ashamed of its birth and glad of its death. Yet one monument in North Carolina achieves the impossible by recording of Confederate soldiers, quote, they died fighting for liberty, end quote. On the other hand, consider the North and the Civil War. Why should we be deliberately false like Woodward and quote, meet General Grant and represent the North as magnanimously freeing the slaves without any effort on his part? The American Negroes are the only people in history of the world, so far as I know, that ever became free without any effort of their own. They had not started the war, nor ended it. They twanged banjos around the railroad station, sang melodious spirituals, and believed that some Yankee would soon come along and give each of them 40 acres of land and a mule, end quote. The North went to war without the slightest idea of freeing the slave. The great majority of Northerners from Lincoln down pledged themselves to protect slavery, and they hated and harried abolitionists. But on the other hand, the thesis which Beall tends to support, that the whole North during and after the war was chiefly interested in making money, is only half true. It was abolition and belief in democracy that gained for a time the upper hand after the war and led the North in Reconstruction. Business followed abolition in order to maintain the tariff, pay the bonds, and defend the banks. To call this business program the program of the North and ignore abolition is unhistorical. And growing ascendancy for a calculable time was a great moral movement which turned the North from its economic defense of slavery and led it to emancipation. Abolitionists attacked slavery because it was wrong, and their moral battle cannot be truthfully minimized or forgotten. Nor does this fact deny that the majority of the Northerners before the war were not abolitionists, that they attacked slavery only in order to win the war and enfranchise the Negro to secure this result. One has but to read the debates in Congress and state papers from Abraham Lincoln down to know that this decisive action which ended the Civil War was the emancipation and arming of the black slave. That, as Lincoln said, without the military help of black freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won, end quote. The freedmen, far from being the inert recipients of freedom at the hands of philanthropists, furnished 200,000 soldiers in the Civil War who took part in nearly 200 battles and skirmishes, and in addition, perhaps 300,000 others as effective laborers and helpers. In proportion to population, more Negroes than whites fought in the Civil War. These people, withdrawn from the support of the Confederacy, with threat of the withdrawal of millions more, made the opposition of the slaveholder useless unless they themselves freed and armed their own slaves. This was exactly what they started to do. They were only restrained by realizing that such action removed the very cause for which they began fighting. Yet one would search current American histories almost in vain to find a clear statement or even faint recognition of these perfectly well authenticated facts. All this is but preliminary to the kernel of the historic problem with which this book deals, and that is Reconstruction. The chorus of agreement concerning the attempt to reconstruct and organize the South after the Civil War and emancipation is overwhelming. There's scarce a child in the street that cannot tell you that the whole effort was a hideous mistake and an unfortunate incident based on ignorance, revenge, and the perverse determination to attempt the impossible. That the history of the United States from 1866 to 1876 is something of which the nation ought to be ashamed and which did more to retard and set back the American Negro than anything that has happened to him. While at the same time, it grievously and wantonly wounded again a part of the nation already hurt to death. True, it is that the Northern historians writing just after the war had scant sympathy for the South and wrote ruthlessly of rebels and slave drivers. They had at least the excuse of a war psychosis. As a young labor leader, Will Herbert writes, quote, "The great traditions of this period, and especially of Reconstruction, are shamelessly repudiated by the official heirs of Stevens and Sumner. In the last quarter of a century, hardly a single book has appeared consistently championing or sympathetically interpreting the great ideals of the crusade against slavery, whereas scores and hundreds have dropped from the presses in ignoble extenuation of the North and open apology for the Confederacy. In measureless abuse of the radical figures of Reconstruction, the Reconstruction period as the logical culmination of decades of previous development has borne the brunt of the reaction. First of all, we have James Ford Rhodes, History of the United States. Rhodes was trained not as a historian, but as an Ohio businessman. He had no broad formal education. When he had accumulated a fortune, he surrounded himself with a retinue of clerks and proceeded to manufacture a history of the United States by mass production. His method was simple. He gathered a vast number of authorities. He selected from these authorities those whose testimony supported his thesis and discarded the others. The majority report of the Great Ku Klux Klan investigation, for instance, he laid aside in favor of the minority report simply because the latter supported his sincere belief. In the report and testimony of the Reconstruction Committee of 15, he did practically the same thing. Above all, he begins his inquiry convinced, without admitting any necessity of investigation, that Negroes are an inferior race. Quote, "No large policy in our country has ever been so conspicuous a failure as that of forcing universal Negro suffrage upon the South. The Negroes who simply acted out of their nature were not to blame. How indeed could they acquire political honesty? What idea could barbarism thrust into slavery obtain of the rights of property? From the Republican policy came no real good to Negroes. Most of them developed no political capacity, and the few who raised themselves above the mass did not reach a high order of intelligence, end quote. Rhodes was primarily the historian of property, of economic history, and the labor movement. He knew nothing of democratic government. He was contemptuous. He was trained to make profits. He used his profits to write history. He speaks again and again of the rulership of intelligence and property. And he makes a plea that intelligent use of the ballot for the benefit of property is the only real foundation of democracy. The real frontal attack on Reconstruction, as interpreted by the leaders of the national thought in 1870 and for some time thereafter, came from the universities, and particularly from Columbia and Johns Hopkins. The movement began with Columbia University and with the advent of John W. Burgess of Tennessee and William A. Dunning of New Jersey as professors of political science and history. Burgess was an ex-Confederate soldier who started to a little Southern college with a box of books, a box of tallow candles, and a Negro boy, and his attitude towards the Negro race in after years was subtly colored by this early conception of Negroes as essentially property like books and candles. Dunning was a kindly and impressive professor who was deeply influenced by a growing up of young Southern students and began with them to rewrite the history of the nation from 1860 to 1880, in more or less conspicuous opposition to the classic interpretations of New England. Burgess was frank and determined in his anti-Negro thought. He expounded his theory of Nordic supremacy, which colored all his political theories. The claim that there is nothing in the color of the skin from the point of view of political ethics is a great sophism. A black skin means membership in a race of men which is never of itself succeeded in subjecting passion to reason, has never therefore created any civilization of any kind. To put such race of men in possession of a state government and a system of federal government is to trust them with the development of political and legal civilization upon the most important subjects of human life. And to do this in communities with a large white population is simply to establish barbarism in power over civilization. Burgess is a Tory and an open apostle of reaction. He tells us that the nation now believes, quote, that it is the white man's mission, his duty and his right to hold the reins of political power in his own hands for the civilization of the world and the welfare of mankind, end quote. For this reason, America is following, quote, the European idea of the duty of civilized races to impose their political sovereignty upon civilized or half-civilized or not fully civilized races anywhere and everywhere in the world, end quote. He complacently believes that, quote, there is something natural in the subordination of an inferior race to a superior race, even to the point of the enslavement of the inferior race. But there is nothing natural in the opposite, end quote. He therefore denominates Reconstruction as the rule, quote, of the uncivilized Negroes over the whites of the South, end quote. This has been the teaching of one of our greatest universities for nearly 50 years. Dunning was less dogmatic as a writer, and his own statements are often judicious. But even Dunning can declare that, quote, all the forces in the South that made for civilization were dominated by a mass of barbarous freedmen, end quote. And that, quote, the antithesis of an antipathy of race and color were crucial and ineradicable, end quote. The work of most of the students whom he taught and encouraged has been one-sided and partisan to the last degree. Johns Hopkins University has issued a series of studies similar to Columbia's. Southern teachers have been welcomed to many Northern universities, while often Negro students have been systematically discouraged, and thus a nationwide university attitude has arisen by which propaganda against the Negro has been carried on unquestioned. The Columbia School of Historians and Social Investigators has issued between 1895 and the present time 16 studies of Reconstruction in the Southern states, all based on the same thesis and all done according to the same method. First, endless sympathy with the white South. Second, ridicule, contempt, or silence for the Negro. Third, a judicial attitude towards the North, which concludes that the North, under great misapprehension, did a grievous wrong, but eventually saw its mistake and retreated. These studies vary, of course, in their methods. Dunning's own work is usually silent so far as the Negro is concerned. Burgess is more than fair in law, but reactionary in matters of race and property, regarding the treatment of a Negro as a man as nothing less than a crime, and admitting that, quote, the mainstay of property is the courts, end quote. In the books on Reconstruction written by graduates of these universities and others, the studies of Texas, North Carolina, Florida, Virginia, and Louisiana are thoroughly bad, giving no complete picture of what happened during Reconstruction, written for the most part by men and women without broad historical or social background, and all designed not to seek the truth, but to prove a thesis. Hamilton reaches the climax of this school when he characterizes the black codes, which even Burgess condemned, as, quote, not only on the whole reasonable, temperate, and kindly, but in the main necessary, end quote. Thompson's Georgia is another case in point. It seems to be fair, but silly stories about Negroes indicating utter lack of even common sense are included, and every notable sentiment from white people. When two Negro workers, William and Jim, put a straightforward advertisement in a local paper, the author says that it was, quote, evidently written by a white friend, end quote. There is not the slightest historical evidence to prove this, and there were plenty of educated Negroes in Augusta at the time who might have written this. Lawn's version of Louisiana puts Sheridan's words in Sherman's mouth to prove a petty point. There are certain of these studies which, though influenced by the same general attitude, nevertheless have more scientific poise and cultural background. Garner's Reconstruction in Mississippi conceives that the Negro as an integral part of the scene and treats him as a human being. With this should be bracketed the recent study of Reconstruction in South Carolina by Simpkins and Woody. This is not as fair as Garner's, but in the midst of conventional judgment and conclusion and reproductions of all available caricatures of Negroes, it does not hesitate to give a fair account of Negroes and of some of their work. It gives the impression of combing in one book two antagonistic points of view, but in the clash, much truth emerges. Ficklin's Louisiana and the works of Fleming are anti-Negro in spirit, but nevertheless they have a certain fairness and sense of historic honesty. Fleming's documentary history of Reconstruction is done by a man who has a thesis to support, and his selection of documents supports his thesis. His study of Alabama is pure propaganda. Next come a number of books which are openly and blatantly propaganda, like Herbert's Solid South, and the books by Pike and Reynolds on South Carolina, the works by Pollard and Carpenter, and especially those by Ulrich Phillips. One of the latest and most popular of the series is The Tragic Era by Claude Bowers, which is an excellent and readable piece of current newspaper reporting, absolutely devoid of historical judgment or sociological knowledge. It is a classic example of historical propaganda of the cheaper sort. We have books like Milton's Age of Hate and Winston's Andrew Johnson, which attempt to rewrite the character of Andrew Johnson. They certainly add to our knowledge of the man and sympathy for his weakness, but they cannot, for students, change the calm testimony of unshaken historical facts. Fewess's Carl Schurz paints the picture of this fine liberal and yet goes out of its way to show that he was quite wrong in what he said he saw in the South. The chief witness in Reconstruction, the emancipated slave himself, has been almost barred from court. His written Reconstruction record has been largely destroyed and nearly always neglected. Only 3 or 4 states have preserved the debates and Reconstruction conventions. There are few biographies of Black leaders. The Negro is refused a hearing because he was poor and ignorant. It is therefore assumed that all Negroes in Reconstruction were ignorant and silly, and therefore a history of Reconstruction in any state can quite ignore him. The result is that most unfair caricatures of Negroes have been carefully preserved, but serious speeches, successful administration, and upright character are almost universally ignored and forgotten. Wherever a black head rises to historic view, it is promptly slain by an adjective: shrewd, notorious, cunning, or pilloried by a sneer, or put out of view by some quite unproven charge of bad moral character. In other words, every effort has been made to treat the Negro's part in Reconstruction with silence and contempt. When recently a student tried to write on education in Florida, he found that the official records of the excellent administration of the colored superintendent of education, Gibbs, who virtually established the Florida public school, had been destroyed. Alabama has tried to obliterate all printed records of Reconstruction. Especially notable is the fact that little attempt has been made to trace carefully the rise and economic development of poor whites and their relation to planters and to Negro labor after the war. There were 5 million or more non-slaveholding whites in the South in 1860, and yet less than 2 million are the families of all slaveholders. Yet one might almost gather from contemporary history that the 5 million left no history and had no descendants. The extraordinary history of the rise and triumph of the poor whites has been largely neglected, even by Southern white students. The whole development of Reconstruction was primarily an economic development, but no economic history or proper material for it has been written. It has been regarded as a purely political matter and politics most naturally divorced from industry. All this is reflected in the textbooks of the day and in the encyclopedias, until we have got to the place where we cannot use our experiences during and after the war for the uplift and enlightenment of mankind. We have spoiled and misconceived the position of the historian. If we are going in the future, not simply with regard to this one question, but with regard to all social problems, to be able to use human experience for the guidance of mankind, we have got to clearly distinguish between fact and desire. In the first place, somebody in each era must make clear the facts with utter disregard to his own wish and desire and belief. What we have got to know, so far as possible, are the things that actually happened in the world. Then with that much clear and open to every reader, the philosopher and prophet has a chance to interpret these facts. But the historian has no right, posing as scientist, to conceal or distort facts. And until we distinguish between these two functions of the chronicler of human action, we are going to render it easy for a muddled world out of sheer ignorance to make the same mistake 10 times over. One is astonished in the study of history at the recurrence of the idea that evil must be forgotten, distorted, skimmed over. We must not remember that Daniel Webster got drunk, but only remember that he was a splendid constitutional lawyer. We must forget that George Washington was a slave owner, or that Thomas Jefferson had mulatto children, or that Alexander Hamilton had Negro blood, and simply remember the things we regard as credible and inspiring. The difficulty, of course, with this philosophy is that history loses its value as an incentive. An example, It paints perfect men and noble nations, but it does not tell the truth. No one reading the history of the United States during 1850 to 1860 can have the slightest doubt left in his mind that Negro slavery was the cause of the Civil War, and yet during and since we learned that a great nation murdered thousands and destroyed millions on the account of abstract doctrines concerning the nature of the federal union. Since the attitude of the nation concerning states' rights has been revolutionized by the development of the central government since the war, the whole argument becomes an astonishing reductio ad absurdum, leaving us apparently with no cause for the Civil War, except the recent reiteration of statements which make the great public men on one side narrow, hypocritical fanatics and liars, while the leaders on the other side were extraordinary and unexampled for their beauty, unselfishness, and fairness. Not a single great leader of the nation during the Civil War and Reconstruction has escaped attack and libel. The magnificent figures of Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens have been besmirched almost beyond recognition. We've been cajoling and flattering the South and slurring the North because the South is determined to rewrite the history of slavery, and the North is not interested in history, but in wealth. This, then, is the book basis upon which today we judge reconciliation. In order to paint the South as a martyr to inescapable fate, to make the North the magnanimous emancipator, and to ridicule the Negro as the impossible joke in the whole development, we have in 50 years, by libel, innuendo, and silence, so completely misstated and obliterated the history of the Negro in America and his relation to work and government that today it's almost unknown. This may be fine romance, but it's not science. It may be inspiring, but it's certainly not the truth. And beyond this, it is dangerous. It is not only part foundation of our present lawlessness and loss of democratic ideals, it has more than that, led the world to embrace and worship the color bar as a social salvation. And it is helping to range mankind in ranks of mutual hatred and contempt at the summons of a cheap and false myth. Nearly all recent books on Reconstruction agree with each other in discarding the government reports of substituting selected diaries, letters, and gossip. Yet it happens that the government records are an historic source of wide and unraveled authenticity. There's a report of the Select Committee of 15, which delved painstakingly into the situation all over the South and called all kinds of conditions of men to testify. They're the report of Carl Schurz and the 12 volumes of reports made on the Ku Klux conspiracy, and above all, the Congressional Globe. None who has not read page by page the Congressional Globe, especially the sessions of the 39th Congress, can possibly have any idea what the problems of Reconstruction facing the United States were in 1865 through 66. Then there were the reports of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Executive and other documentary reports of government officials, especially in the War and Treasury departments, which give the historian the only groundwork upon which he can build a real and truthful picture. There are certain historians who have not tried deliberately to falsify the pictures. Southern whites like Francis Butler Lee and Susan Smedes. Northern historians like McPherson, Oberholzer, Nicolay, and Hay. There are foreign travelers like Sir George Campbell, Georges Clemenceau, and Robert Somers. There are the personal reminiscence of Augustus Beard, George Julian, George F. Hoare, Carl Schurz, and John Sherman. There are the invaluable work of Edward McPherson and the more recent studies by Paul Haworth, A. Taylor, and Charles Wesley. Bill simply does not take Negroes into account in the critical year of 1866. Certain monographs deserve all praise, like those of Hendricks and Pierce. The book of Flackett's Prejudice, but built on study. The defense of the carpetbagging regime by Tourget and Allen, Powell, Clayton, Holden, and Warmoth are worthy antidotes to the certain writers. The lives of Stevens and Sumner are revealing even when slightly apologetic, because the Negro, while Andrew Johnson is beginning to suffer from writers who are proving or who are trying to prove how seldom he got drunk and think that important, it will be noted that for my authority in this work, I have depended very largely upon secondary material, upon state histories of Reconstruction, written in the main by those who were convinced before they began to write that the Negro was incapable of government or of becoming a constituent part of a civilized state. The fairest of these histories have not tried to conceal facts. In other cases, the black man has been largely ignored, while in still others, he has been traduced and ridiculed. If I had time and money and opportunity to go back to the original sources in all cases, there can be no doubt that the weight of this work would have been vastly strengthened, and as I firmly believe, the case of the Negro more convincingly set forth. Various volumes of papers in the great libraries, like the Johnson Papers in the Library of Congress, the Sumner manuscripts at Harvard, the Schurz correspondence, the Wells Papers, the Chase Papers, the Fessenden and Greeley collections, the McCullough, McPherson, Sherman, Stevens, and Trumbull papers, all must have much of great interest to the historians of the American Negro. I have not had the time nor opportunity to examine these, and most of those who examined them had little interest in black folk. Negroes have done some excellent work on their own history and defense. It suffers, of course, from natural partisanship and a desire to prove a case in the face of a chorus of unfair attacks. Its best work also suffers from the fact that Negroes with difficulty reach an audience. But this is also true of such white writers as Skaggs and Bancroft, who could not get first-class publishers because they were saying something that the nation did not like. The Negro historians begin with autobiographies and reminiscence. The older historians were George W. Williams and Joseph T. Wilson. The new school historians is led by Carter G. Woodson, and I have been greatly helped by the unpublished thesis of 4 of the youngest Negro students. It is unfortunate that while many young white Southerners can get funds to attack and ridicule the Negro and his friends, it is almost impossible for first-class Negro students to get a chance for research to get finished work in print. I write then in a field devastated by passion and belief. Naturally, as a Negro, I cannot do this writing without believing in the essential humanity of Negroes and their ability to be educated, to do the work of the modern world, to take their place as equal citizens with others. I cannot for a moment subscribe to that bizarre doctrine of race that makes most men inferior to the few. But 2, as a student of science, I want to be fair, objective, and judicial, to let no searing of the memory by intolerable insult and cruelty make me fail to sympathize with human frailties and contradiction and the eternal paradox of good and evil. But armed and warned by all of this, and fortified by long study of facts, I stand at the end of this writing literally aghast at what American historians have done to this field. What is the object of writing the history of Reconstruction? Is it to wipe out the disgrace of a people which fought to make slaves of Negroes? Is it to show that the North had higher motives than freeing black men? Is it to prove that Negroes were black angels? No. It is simply to establish the truth on which right in the future may be built. We may never have a science of history until we have in our colleges men who regard the truth as more important than the defense of the white race, and who will not deliberately encourage students to gather thesis material in order to support a prejudice or buttress a lie. 3/4 of the testimony against the Negro in Reconstruction is on the unsupported evidence of men who hated and despised Negroes and regarded it as loyalty to blood, patriotism to country, and tribute to the fathers to lie, steal, or kill in order to discredit these black folks. This may be a natural result when a people have been humbled and impoverished and degraded in their own life, But what is inconceivable is that another generation and another group should regard this testimony as scientific truth, when it is contradicted by logic and by fact. This chapter, therefore, which in logic should be a survey of books and sources, becomes a sheer necessity, an arrangement of American historians, and an indictment of their ideals. With a determination unparalleled in science, the mass of American writers have started so to distort the facts of the greatest critical period of American history as to prove right wrong and wrong right. I'm not familiar enough with this vast field of human history to pronounce on the relative guilt of these historians of other times and fields. But I do say that if history of the past has been written in the same fashion, it is useless as science and misleading as ethics. It simply shows that with sufficient general agreement and determination amongst the dominant classes, the truth of history may be utterly distorted and contradicted and changed to any convenient fairy tale that the masters of men wish. I cannot believe that any unbiased mind with an ideal of truth and of scientific judgment can read the plain, authentic facts of our history during 1860 to 1880 and come to conclusions essentially different from mine. And yet I stand virtually alone in this interpretation. So much so that the very constancy of my facts would make me hesitate did I not seem to see plain reasons. Subtract from Burgess his belief that only white people can rule, and he is in essential agreement with me. Remember that Rhodes was an uneducated moneymaker who hired clerks to find the facts which he needed to support his thesis. And one is convinced that the same labor and expense could easily produce quite opposite results. One fact and one alone explains the attitude of most recent writers towards Reconstruction. They cannot conceive Negroes as men. In their minds, the word Negro connotes inferiority and stupidity, lightened only by unreasoning gaiety and humor. Suppose the slaves of 1860 had been white folks. Stevens would have been a great statesman, Sumner a great Democrat, and Schurz a keen prophet in a mighty revolution of rising humanity. Ignorance and poverty would easily have been explained by history, and the demand for land and the franchise would have been justified as the birthright of natural freedmen. But Burgess was a slaveholder, Dunning a copperhead, and Rhodes an exploiter of wage labor. Not one of them apparently ever met an educated Negro of force and ability. Around such impressive thinkers gathered the young post-war students from the South. They had been born and reared in the bitterest period of Southern race hatred, fear, and contempt. Their instinctive reactions were confirmed and encouraged in the best of American universities. Their scholarship, when it regarded black men, became deaf, dumb, and blind. The clearest evidence of Negro ability, work, honesty, patience, learning, and efficiency became distorted into cunning, brute toil, shrewd evasion, cowardice, and imitation, a stupid effort to transcend nature's law. For those 7 mystic years between Johnson's swing around the circle and the Panic of 1873, a majority of thinking Americans in the North believed in the equal manhood of black folk. They acted accordingly with a clear-cut decisiveness and thorough logic utterly incomprehensible to a day like ours, which does not share this human faith. And to Southern whites, this period can only be explained by deliberate vengeance and hate. The Panic of 1873 brought sudden dissolution in business, enterprise, economic organization, religious belief, and political standards. A flood of appeal from the white South reinforced this reaction. Appeal with no longer the arrogant bluster of slave oligarchy, but the simple moving of the plight of a conquered people. The resulting emotional and intellectual rebound of the nation made it nearly inconceivable in 1876 that 10 years earlier most men had believed in human equality. Assuming, therefore, as axiomatic the endless inferiority of the Negro race, these newer historians, mostly Southerners, some Northerners who deeply sympathized with the South, misinterpreted, distorted, even deliberately ignored any fact that challenged or contradicted this assumption. If the Negro was admittedly subhuman, what need to waste time delving into Reconstruction history? Consequently, historians of Reconstruction, with a few exceptions, ignore the Negro as completely as impossible, leaving the reader wondering why an element apparently so insignificant filled the whole Southern picture at the time. The only real excuse for this attitude is loyalty to a lost cause, reverence for brave fathers and suffering mothers and sisters, and fidelity to the ideals of a clan and class. But in propaganda against the Negro since emancipation in this land, we face one of the most stupendous efforts the world ever saw to discredit human beings, an effort involving universities, history, science, social life, and religion. The most magnificent drama in the last 1,000 years of human history is the transportation of 10 million human beings out of a dark beauty of their mother continent into a newfound El Dorado of the West. They descended into hell. And in the 3rd century, they arose from the dead in the finest effort to achieve democracy for the working millions which this world had ever seen. It was a tragedy that beguiled the Greek. It was an upheaval of humanity like the Reformation and the French Revolution. Yet we are blind and led by the blind. We discern in it no part of our labor movement, no part of our industrial triumph, no part of our religious experience. Before the dumb eyes of 10 generations of 10 million children, it is made mockery of and spit upon, a degradation of the eternal mother, a sneer at human effort, with aspiration and art deliberately and elaborately distorted. And why? Because in a day when the human mind aspired to a science of human action, a history and psychology of the mighty effort of the mightiest century, we fell under the leadership of those who would compromise with truth in the past in order to make peace in the present and guide policy in the future. One reads the truer, deeper facts of Reconstruction with a great despair. It is at once so simple and human and yet so futile. There is no villain, no idiot, no saint. There are just men who crave ease and power, men who know want and hunger, men who have crawled. They all dream and strive with ecstasy of fear and strain of effort, balked of hope and hate. Yet the rich world is wide enough for all, wants all, needs all. So slight a gesture, a word might set the strife in order, not with full content, but with growing dawn of fulfillment. Instead, roars the crash of hell, and after its whirlwind, a teacher sits in academic halls, learned in the tradition of its elms and its elders. He looks into the upturned face of youth, and in him, youth see the gowned shape of wisdom, and hears the voice of God. Cynically, he sneers at chinks and niggers. He says that the nation has changed its views in regards to the political relation of race and has at last virtually accepted the ideas of the South upon that subject. The white men of the South need now have no further fear that the Republican Party or Republican administrators will ever again give themselves over to the vain imagination of the political equality of man. Immediately in Africa, a black back runs red with the blood of the lash. In India, a brown girl is raped. In China, a coolie starves. In Alabama, 7 darkies are more than lynched, while in London, the white limbs of a prostitute are hung with jewels and silk. Flames of jealous murder sweep the earth, while brains of little children smear the hills. This is the education in the 1935th year of the Christ. This is modern and exact social science. This is the university course in History 12, set down by Senatus Academicus ad quo ha literate pervenite, salutum in domino sepertanum. I'm sorry, I can't read Latin. I'm so sorry. It just is what it is. In Babylon, dark Babylon, who take the wage of shame? The scribe and singer, one by one, the toil for gold and fame, they grovel to their master's mood. The blood upon the pen assigns their souls to servitude, yea, and the souls of men. George Sterling, In the Marketplace, from Selected Poems, used by permission of Harry Robertson, Redwood City, California. End of chapter. Ooh.